64-mile marker, southbound at 69. A truck come across ahead of van head on down here. 64-mile marker. 64-mile lane. Yeah, as a matter of fact, I just missed him. Okay, we got you. That van. Get some help on him.
The identification of the decedent as Whitney Sirak was made by the Grant County Coroner's Office with Whitney Sirak ID by Taylor University administrative staff.
We, had every reason to believe that it was from the start that it was Laura Van Ryn who had been airlifted to Fort Wayne that night, and that it was Whitney who in fact had died.
The Grant County Coroner's Office is confirming the mistaken identification of Whitney Sirak and Laura Van Ryn.
Who's to blame for one family being told their daughter died when in fact she survived a horrific car accident?
I think they're all to blame. Basically from start to finish. I mean, it's pretty crazy.
I would blame the coroner for that.
If anybody's at fault, it would have to be the hospital.
I don't think this is a situation of pointing fingers. It's just all for our prayers.
That's what they had to say. Now it's your call.
CN8's Emmy Award-winning It's Your Call with Lynn Doyle starts now.
Good evening and thank you for joining us. I'm Lynn Doyle. Tonight, getting your thoughts on the heart-wrenching story out of Indiana about two young women involved in a deadly car crash and how their case of mistaken identity has left many around the country saddened and shocked. It is a story of tragedy, of sorrow, of anger and anguish, and yet it's a miracle that's brought subdued joy to many. In what the coroner is calling a disaster, the girls' families were told Laura Van Ryn had survived and Whitney Sirak had died. But 5 weeks after the crash, Van Ryn's family realized it had been misinformed. Their daughter had in fact perished, and it was Whitney who had been healing in a Michigan hospital. The Van Ryns' worst nightmare had now come true. And yet, it is a miracle for the Sirak family. Now, of course, all across the country, many are asking who's to blame for this tragic mix-up. I'm sure you have questions about this case as well, so if you'd like to talk to any of our experts, we suggest that you start calling now. First, though, we want to get a better look at how Laura Van Ryn's family and friends paid tribute to her at a memorial that took place in Grand Rapids over the weekend. For that, Keith Baldy has more right off the top.
Sing a simple song of love.
The songs and prayers at Laura Van Ryn's memorial service were similar to most, but this was not a funeral. There was no casket, no body to bury yet, because it still lies in a grave in Gaylord, Michigan. That's where Laura was buried a month ago, when these family and friends and everyone thought Laura was alive, and her classmate Whitney Sirak had been killed.
I saw her hands, her feet, her complexion, and I couldn't believe that it wasn't her.
Laura's boyfriend spoke about visiting her in a Grand Rapids rehabilitation center, but it was not Laura, it was Whitney. A coroner in Indiana misidentified their bodies following an April car accident that killed 3 other Taylor University students.
Many of you today are probably wondering how a man could date a girl and love a girl for 3 years and not know that it was her. I asked myself that same question.
Many of those who spoke about Laura talked about the confusion they were feeling. For more than a month, her family had thanked God for sparing her life, only to find out she had been gone all along.
Though my mind is limited and I don't understand the events of the last 5 weeks, you do.
But the service was not just about mistaken identity. More than anything, it was about the life of Laura Van Ryn and how much pain her loved ones are now feeling.
It was interesting to me how losing someone you love so much can change your perspective on everything. How my heart is so long for the day when I will be able to embrace you once more.
This tragic mix-up of identities has left the Van Ryn family in mourning, of course, while the Sirak family is now able to celebrate the life of their daughter, Whitney. Our next guest got to know the Siraks on a personal level while covering this story. Michael Jones is a reporter for the Gaylord Herald-Times. He's joining us now from Mount Pleasant, Michigan. Mike, thanks so much for being with us.
Thank you. It's my pleasure.
The question on everyone's mind is, how could this happen? How could someone be declared dead when, in fact, they are not?
Well, I think, first of all, you have to go back to the night of the crash, April 26th, when the semi-tractor trailer had crossed the median of I-69 and slammed into the student van from Taylor University. The impact from the crash literally tore off one side of the vehicle, ejecting students, cafeteria workers, and book bags, wallets, purses, whatever. I've heard it described as the most horrific accident scene that a state trooper from the Indiana State Police had ever seen. And I can imagine when the first responders arrived on the scene, the chaos that must have ensued. And I would assume also that their first responsibility was to see to the wounded or the injured and see that they receive the proper medical treatment.
And then, of course, as you said, the chaos broke out. It was described as mayhem there, and yet it is still someone's responsibility, whether it be the coroner or the police department, to identify the victims of the crash. Where was the breakdown in that identification process?
I think it began, you have to realize that who they thought was Laura, which actually was Whitney, had suffered severe life-threatening injuries, and when they arrived at the scene, they immediately called for air transport, and she was taken to the hospital. At that point, then, you only had one of the girls there who was dead. Both of them similar physiques, long blonde hair, blue eyes, and medical emergency responders there. Like I say, their first responsibility wasn't to identify who was who. It was to get these people to the hospital and save their lives. And so I can understand where, in that moment of chaos and confusion, first responder may have looked at a medical ID or driver's license or school photo and made that incorrect decision of who it was that had actually died, and from there, the mistake just was not caught.
There had been some published reports indicating that there were other students or witnesses on the scene that actually identified the victim. Now we know incorrectly. Is that true, or is that something that has been investigated and perhaps is not a warranted fact?
There was a second school van that was also coming back. What was happening was they were coming back from a campus at Fort Wayne, and the second school bus or school van had stopped to gas up and came upon the accident scene a few minutes later. I don't know exactly then what ensued, but I can imagine the other van that came upon the accident, students in there must have been, just hysterical and, very frightened to come upon that scene and to see, their friends and coworkers, injured and, many of them, dead. So I'm not sure if they helped with the initial identification process there or if it happened later at the coroner's office. I do know Taylor officials did arrive at the coroner's office and tried to help identify the victims at that time.
We're going to talk more about that in just a moment, but first I'd like to invite our viewers to join in our conversation. I'm sure that you are intrigued by this story. What is a heartbreaking story for one family is a reason to celebrate and be joyous for another. So what are your thoughts on this case of mistaken identity? Who do you think is to blame for the mix-up? We'll be talking about that later. Do you think it's the coroner, the deputy coroner, the hospital, even the families? And what about the families themselves? Do you have questions about how they were unable to identify their own daughters? If you have questions about this case, we have a lot of experts who will be joining us tonight, and of course many ways for you to be interactive. You can give us a call. It is toll-free from wherever you're watching across the country. You can also email me or take our web poll. That's both at cn8.tv. Now, when you log on to CN8 programs and find the It's Your Call webpage, you can actually be part of tomorrow night's show. Tonight, our focus Tuesday is gun control, so if you have an opinion on what should be done about our nation's growing problems with gun violence, you can actually get a jump start on that. Right now, though, it is this story that has just intrigued us for the last week, and we'd like to know what your questions are about it. I have plenty. I'm going to pose them to our next guest. He is Dr. Jonathan Briskin, who is a forensic pathologist in the Philadelphia metropolitan area and a member of the National Association of Medical Examiners. Doctor, thank you so much for being with us.
Well, thank you for inviting me.
I understand that while this doesn't happen often, a case of mistaken identity is not totally unheard of in the medical profession.
Well, that's for sure. It does happen from time to time, but it's a pretty rare occurrence. There are a lot of things that we go through to try to prevent this from happening.
Well, I guess I'll ask you the same question that I asked Mike right off the top, and that is, how could something like this happen? What kinds of injuries would these girls had to have sustained in order for their own parents, a boyfriend, a friend, anyone looking at them, not to be able to tell who was who?
Well, I have to say first, I don't know exactly what injuries were suffered, but certainly, for example, in a hospitalized patient who's intubated, having a tube in their mouth and tape, there may have been head injuries with bandages. Usually there's a lot of intravenous fluids that make the body swell. So just many of the normal identifying features are obscured by injury and treatment. So I can understand how in the hospital they may not recognize her. The coroner's office is a little different situation because there you're not, you don't have bandages obscured. One thing I have no knowledge of in this case is how serious the injuries were, particularly to the face and head of the young lady who did die.
Well, perhaps Mike can fill us in on that. What kind of information can you give us about the injuries that we know Laura now sustained that evening?
From what I have heard, she had suffered several broken bones, a broken arm, broken leg, severe head injury, as well as I know a gash across her forehead. So in the hospital she would have been in a neck brace, bandage across the forehead. Not horribly, disfiguring type of injuries where, the person would be unrecognizable. That is one of the, I guess, intriguing things about this is that when we first heard about it, we assumed that the, injuries to the face were, such that it would hinder the identification, but it seems to be that the injuries were not all that severe as far as being able to identify the individual.
Now, while the injuries, Doctor, may not have been as severe, I do understand that her family did not want to see her in this broken state, and as such, no one from the family actually physically looked at her to declare that, yes, this was my daughter. Could that have lended itself to some of this confusion?
Well, definitely. Because, part of the standard practice of identification is having a family member, next of kin, or a close friend make an identification. And that's usually done either from a photograph or maybe a closed-circuit viewing of the head and face area. Generally, you wouldn't bring someone down into the morgue facility. That is a little too much. But even if you weren't able to have someone do that immediately, because this is a very upsetting situation, needless to say, after calm sets in, this still can be done. It can even be done after an autopsy is performed.
Any word on that, Mike, in terms of the family's perspective, why parents or friends or relatives did not personally identify the body?
Well, I know Whitney has a sister who also attends Taylor University, so she would have only been 10 miles or so away from the accident itself or where the temporary morgue had been set up, and my understanding is that she was summoned to identify the body, but because of the trauma of it, she was had to have help standing, and just was in a bad state of mind, and so I don't know who it was, but suggested that maybe she not view the body for an identification. Apparently they must have felt that they had enough to go on to be confident in their identification of the victim.
And of course, then we learned that 5 weeks later, it is in fact a different young woman who had perished that evening. We're talking about that. We're going to be taking your phone calls in just a moment. If you'd like to join in with your thoughts on this terrible mix-up and perhaps your questions on how this could have happened, we'd certainly like to hear from you. Hopefully, we can give you some of the answers that you and the other families are seeking. You can also email me, or you can weigh in by taking our web poll, which tonight is asking who's to blame for this mistaken identity. Is it the coroner, the deputy coroner, or is it just a tragic mix-up and it's no one's fault? Log on to cn8.tv. Tell us what you think. We'll check in at the half hour. But more importantly, if you have questions or comments, call us during the break, because in 3 minutes we'll hear from you.